Hey, this is Todd Neef. You're listening to my show where I sometimes talk to interesting people and unpack their models of how they think about the world. We got James FitzGerald on the podcast for a repeat performance, an encore performance. And James is the founder of OPEX, which is a coaching education company, which has had a pretty profound impact on my thought process surrounding coaching and best practices and program design and assessment and all that good stuff. And James and I had a conversation about how he actually systemizes and tries to communicate his organized thoughts to the world. So he recently created a course called Mixed Modal, which is about program design and coaching for athletes who are competing in essentially CrossFit, the sport of fitness, any type of mixed modal, messing around with a bunch of different activities and different time frames and all that sort of stuff. And James has systemized his thought process here enough such that he can actually communicate it to other people, which is pretty interesting in such a chaotic environment. So we actually break down how James thinks about systems, how he organizes his thoughts, and then how he attempts to synthesize them into something that other people can actually learn from. And also how to see order in the chaos, which I think for James, his pattern recognition is pretty great, and his cause and effect meter is maybe dialed a little bit higher than mine, but that makes it interesting in terms of his ability to actually, make statements and say, hey, this is the way it is, and this is what I've seen. There's a little bit of clanging and banging in the background here. We actually edited most of it out, but there was some construction going on next to the gym. And as James mentions, it's sort of like the Ernest Shackleton expedition to Antarctica, and which always makes me think of Rusty Shackelford from King of the Hill. But anyway, edited most of that out, so should be good to go there. But apologies for any slamming of concrete here in the background. All right, check it out. Hope you enjoy. We're here online talking about some higher order questions. What was your pronunciation of that, James?
HOQ.
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 Yeah, exactly.
Or if you're from Newfoundland, it's HOQ.
H. Cool. So we're having a discussion just about James has created some courses over time, CCP being sort of like a foundational principles, a lot of different coaching principles and synthesis of knowledge and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And then more recently, Mixed Modal being a sport specific course based upon training athletes to compete in like mixed modal sport, sort of as popularized by CrossFit. Oh, and there's a water heater being replaced. So you may hear some clanging and banging in the background. That created a nice rainstorm. Yeah, it created a nice rainstorm in our side room the other day. So yeah, getting that fixed up.
We're not robots. This is real.
Facilitated by robots, but we are not yet robots. But in terms of this idea of sort of like synthesizing knowledge, I know throughout throughout my CCP course that I took, there's a lot of reference to Bernie Novakowski, and I know that he was a huge influence on your thinking and trying to really clarify principles. So I figured I'd start with just asking you, what did you actually learn from Bernie, and how did he teach you to essentially to think and communicate about thinking?
Yeah, well, I think we used it in the HOQ conversation on a higher order questioning. Really, the word higher order is what his business was, which was higher order thinking. And what he taught me, Todd, was systems and how to extract systems from really on a global position, everything, like how things work together, why they work together, what are the energies that are between different frameworks. And he taught me essentially, if you were to strip down all the things that are happening, in all different areas, we would hammer on one single unit thing, which is called the monad, and discuss everything around that specific unit. And then secondarily, how to look at a dyad, which means there's two things, and the tensions that are between these two things and how they interact. And then continue up the scale, as you can imagine, a triad, tetrad, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and continue up to see how all these things work together, and then extract what you see in all those, and how you can use those systems and ideas around systems to make sense of things, if that makes sense. Does it make a little bit of sense in what I'm discussing?
Yeah, sure. So let's maybe bring that back to like a specific example. So, with every time you introduce a new layer of complexity or like something that varies, right? I mean, we're adding degrees of freedom to the system. So like the number of permutations of ways that things can be increases at a pretty rapid rate, right? So I guess the concept that you're talking about is trying to reduce it down to one thing and develop an understanding of that, and then potentially be able to build a more robust understanding of the way that that thing then relates to other things in the same environment. Is that an accurate summary?
Yeah, exactly. And it's really stripping all of that information down just to look at principles. To look at I'll take one example of relationships. So in a relationship, you can look at it as being the relationship as being the monad, and then you can look at the two people in the relationship as the dyad, and then you can look at the relations, the two of the people in a triad, and the third, the reconciler, is the area of communication or whatever it is between the relationship of those two people, if I'm making sense. And now you can go further and further up, but you could pick relationship, you could pick education, you could pick fitness, you could, so what Bernie taught me, back to your original question, was to really look at systems and systems thinking, and the power around organizing those systems into a way that would make it understandable and make sense to people.
So, question on that then. I mean, in the relationship example, right? If we talk about the relationship between two people, you said that the relationship itself would potentially be the monad.
Yeah.
So the single aspect of the system is like almost the highest order piece of it then.
Yes.
And then that breaks down further into like more complex pieces with more degrees of freedom. Is that correct?
Yeah. No, that's a different language of it, but yeah, it's on the same premise.
Yeah, got it. And then is it ever built the other direction, right? Meaning that you have, I don't know what the correct way to articulate it would be as far as relationships, but do you ever go all the way down to a granular level and then try to build from a monad at say like maybe a specific interaction in a relationship and then try to build up from there?
Yeah, I think the question you're asking makes sense to me, but it's the incorrect way to look at systems. They all exist. That's the way you need to look at it. And it's not about building up or down. I just gave you the example of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to give examples of how to look at and observe systems. So I'm sure that probably larger than, it's probably outside of my brain capabilities, but there probably is like systems of systems, which is what you're asking. Like, is it better to go and look at it in one way, one direction over the other? And I don't have the answer to that. But what I know is that everything has all these systems entwined inside of it. And you just want to be able to extract the fact that those are present, Todd, and not necessarily think about building.
Yeah, sure. Because I think especially with any real life thing, right? If we could use fitness as an example, since that's something that we are both involved in at some level, right? That we're dealing with like complexity and emergence, right? Where if we try to get too granular with, let's say, mechanistic explanations of muscle hypertrophy, or like, oh, you're upregulating this hormone, therefore you should take this supplement or something like that, that it's pretty easy to get led astray because you're not able to then take into account the entire complexity of the system and the fact that just because you've, say, elevated post-workout testosterone, does it actually result in anything anyone cares about as far as, change in body composition or performance? The answer is often no, it doesn't. So from this perspective of the type of systems thinking that you're talking about, you're looking at the big picture piece first, and then trying to break down into the more granular pieces.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. Then in terms of using these principles to organize your thoughts, how do you then take your, I guess, like lived experience as well as your experience with, other mentors or content surrounding, say, coaching or developing athletes, and then try to build your own system based upon that?
Yeah, for thought processes, what Bernie had offered is, again, to look at the process of, first of all, ordering and organizing before you orchestrate. and that's called O cubed. I think you were a part of the original life coaching, maybe within CCP, in which we kept that within the curriculum. But the way that I was, they helped me recognize, I should say, in order to organize my thoughts, and in order to order them effectively, to communicate most effectively with the person I was trying to communicate with, was to put them in a certain rank order of, higher order mechanisms. So is it a thought process, for example, that's just good enough right now? And is that what's good enough to get the communication across? And if that is the case, how am I going to organize those thoughts so that I can, quote unquote, orchestrate it, i.e. communicate to the person? And so, I think that what Bernie offered, as well as what I saw present then after what he offered to me, was that a way that I could fundamentally see why I was thinking the way I was thinking. And when you gain, I don't know another word for it, Todd, but it felt to me like I gained more control over my thought process. It allowed more freedom to selectively choose how I was going to organize my thoughts based upon the stimulus that was in front of me, whether that was relationship disagreement, it was a client, it was thoughts with myself in my own head for competition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So you're then essentially able to use actual experiences as a constant updating to your system then. Yeah.
And, I'm not sure if you purposely mentioned that of updating, but that's a higher order version of O cubed, which you will also remember is the mind and how to take these organization of thoughts. And you really, have this organization of thoughts that should get to the point where they're automatic, right? That's the whole goal based upon your commentary. But then over time, these automatic thoughts move up and they get into sensory thoughts, and then they move up into creative thoughts, and then eventually they become directive thoughts. And that's where we get into, and I hope I'm not going sideways on it, but that's where we get into being able to notice.
The whole point is to go sideways.
Okay, what happens there is you then get into noticing your noticing. And so now you're organizing your thoughts with a purpose in order to do what you just mentioned, which was to create so much automaticity inside of your thoughts that it becomes upgraded.
Sure. So you're developing the metacognition to be aware of your own thought process, while simultaneously having a lot of the, lower order pieces occurring more automatically. So there's less, energy required to, mental energy required to kind of move through those pieces.
Yeah.
And I think that, something that sticks out to me there, which in any complex type of situation, like coaching fitness athletes or running a business or, sport or financial training or something like that, that there's a clear difference between people who are kind of like learning random rules with that versus people who are building a system, right? So I think I heard this example recently surrounding something like chess, where someone may be learning chess and, they may lose a game and their takeaway may be, don't move your pawn to this spot. Where someone else may have had the exact same experience and lost. And, their takeaway isn't, don't move your pawn here. It's that, in this shape of the game, moving the pawn may be the right move, but there's now a 40% chance that this like other scenario will happen, which will then cause me to lose. So, they're not learning a specific rule. They're learning like a bigger picture outcome of what their actions can result in, right? So they may still take an action that resulted in them losing, but they just have a better understanding of like the probability, for example, of a certain type of outcome happening.
Yeah, that's ironically just what I talked about yesterday on mixed modal skills is what you described. The person recognized the power in knowledge of process over knowledge of results. It's a similar thing that you're discussing there. When it comes to fitness, that's immediately where my brain goes, is that if you teach that person, so you use your analogy of the pawn, and I would say, your grip position on the bar muscle up, where if they recognize that about the journey and what they did within the journey of the test or task, that's going to be a better consolidated motor learning pattern, as opposed to someone going like, I should have had more chalk to put my finger in a certain position, Do you know what I mean? So it's the same kind of idea of knowledge of process as opposed to knowledge of results.
Yeah, and that you have to be able to bake in to your updating process the fact that your outcome might not always be what you want it to be, but that doesn't mean that your process was incorrect.
No, and that's those are deeper layers in building a relationship and, allowing the athlete to be able to fail and being knowledge of the fact that they're going to be, working on those things and trying to achieve that specific thing that they're going for. All those things need to be, like you say, baked in.
So when you have, let's say, a model for, we could use something like a mixed modal sport performance that you've built up over time, again, based upon experience coaching, competing yourself, as well as, past experience with mentors and books and all that kind of stuff. How do you go about either attempting to confirm or disconfirm what that model looks like?
Yeah, well, for the education for mixed modal, I'll just give you, my ideas that I had in mind and purposes and intentions, and then you can just work backwards based upon my answer for it if I get at what you're asking there. There was a dying need to, in my mind, to create order and structure to the principles around mixed modal, along with like some sidebars on culture, sport, and this unspoken topic, right, of progression and, just a bit of an argument against the freestyle method, right, that's inside of the sport. So that was the intention of it. It was to create, some kind of platform so that people could get all this information around what my thoughts are on how to create some order and structure to the sport in general. And so I take the perspective then, as I put it together, of that coach and athlete out there who have been and who were either directly asking or indirectly asking for someone to speak some of the real truths that are actually happening within progression of the sport and what's happening at the physiological and the psychological level, for people to progress in it. And that's how it came to be. So I don't know if that helps answer the question on the structuring of it.
Sure. So let's say you have some sort of thesis about mixed modal sport. So like what would be one of your theses, if that is the correct plural?
I don't know how to answer that. I've even done courses on research and design, but I wouldn't know how to do it for the outcomes for mixed modal. I think maybe if there's one line to it, if it doesn't suffice, then ask it another way, Todd. But I think it would be structure to the chaos around mixed modal.
Sure. So kind of like big picture is that the sport is inherently chaotic, but that doesn't always mean that chaos is the best way to train. But there has to be a structured way to approach chaos.
Yeah.
In order to progress.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Or if not a correct way, ideas on ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, let me try attacking this from maybe a slightly different way.
Okay.
What is something throughout, let's say, the last several years that you have potentially changed your mind on with regards to like coaching in mixed modal sport?
What are the things that, I'm sorry, I missed the middle part of that. What are the things that changed?
Yeah, what's something that you've changed your mind on? Say 5 years ago, you're like, oh, okay, this is a principle of design or coaching or what have you for athletes. And now you're like, man, that actually doesn't make any sense.
Oh, yeah. For sure, I would say is probably the role of the kinds of contractions that are inside the building of capacity. So I knew that what we had in place with mixed modal as of, circa 2004, I knew that it was really weird to do, power cleans and ring dips and run around the building, and to think that's the same kind of fatigue and, limitation model as if you were to do the same amount of time but being on a bicycle. And I kind of knew it, right? But I used, just science and empirical work, observational data, along with my background in science for research and design, as well as fatigue for muscle, as well as my aerobic experience or cardiovascular science experience. And then I kind of layered that over what I saw as being progressive pieces for mixed modal. And then as time has gone on, I've recognized the exact same thing, but I've now classified it in an area that is easier language for me. And that would be what I've changed, I would say, on the past 5 years, is the role of muscle endurance. And I would say just the biggest change has been recognizing the importance of it in how it goes inside of aerobic capacity.
So you sort of had a more, let's call it, traditional endurance model of conditioning for mixed modal sport. Is that like
I had that
summary? For
sure. I had that. You could just think of it this way. Like I had it above my head, as I was writing designs in 2008, let's say, it was above my head. And when you looked on paper, I probably still did have, similar styles of progression for individuals. But now I can just see I've changed significantly on the importance of it. That's really what I'm saying there, is the importance of muscle endurance for capacity.
And then, so what process led you to change your belief on that, right? Because it's, you're maybe not totally discarding some of those models and some of those principles, but clearly it's like, okay, this is a model that's developed for this sport that requires people to be on a bike for this much time in one sitting. But now, like you said, we're running around the building and doing power cleans and ring dips. And, over time that's shifted in terms of how you think those work and what's important there. So how has that shift occurred?
Yeah, I think the way which would make sense of it, if you can think of it, is like, it's still 15 minutes of work, right? That's still the global picture. And then like 10 years ago, it was seen as like, well, it's 15 minutes of work, but the contractions are different, right? And then 5 years ago, it's like, okay, the sport is really saying that this is the qualifying that's required in order to participate and compete. And that fundamentally, Todd, to answer your question, is the change, is that the sport has, it's young, but it has started to develop to define exactly what it is as a sport, like what is actually required inside of it. And I know it looks, to the outside looking in, it just looks like these random tests, which they are, and they do have different doses, there's no doubt, but there's still underneath it, it's now more of a defining note that muscle endurance and how it's valued within it, and how it's tested, that fundamentally is what has changed. Back to your question on, what changed that, or what, shook up my sights on it, is looking at exactly what the competitive scenario is, and then redesigning it, right? Back, 10 years back for someone, and being like, what is the model that would be best in place for this person to express as best as possible now that the sport is becoming more defined? And it's not super defined, Todd, as you know, but we're getting pretty damn close to it, so where you have, we don't have one event on a Sunday afternoon anymore. It's not just like a 3-minute event on a Sunday, right? And people be like, of course there's not. It's not just a 3-minute event. It's like, okay, well, what is there? Well, there's a 3-minute event, and then there's like a Sunday morning 5K run. And then people are like, well, it's not only 2 events. There's got to be more. It's like, yeah, you are correct. Okay, well, what is there more? And so that's my point, is that we've defined what the competition floor looks like and what the competitive scenario requires, and then we just reverse engineer backwards. To my point, muscle endurance has a big part to play in that progression based upon the ideal expression of the sport now.
Yeah, got it. So just kind of a combination of seeing the sport grow over time, as well as just what characteristics lead people to actually have success.
Yes. Yeah.
And to circle back to our initial discussion surrounding some of Bernie's ideas about higher order thinking. So if you take sport, for example, right, if we take mixed modal sport, what in this context is the monad, so to speak?
Yeah. Are you asking if in the context of higher, is mixed modal the monad?
Yeah, like what does that look like? And then how does that break down?
Oh, it depends upon the context of, what you want to discuss. So if it's mixed modal as the sport, I could give it a shot in terms of building them up and going further and further. Mixed modal, if you want to think of it as what would be a monad of mixed modal of the sport, it would be mixed modal itself, its entirety. Not the education, not the system itself, but the entirety. So the entirety of the sport. And what you and I were just having conversation over would be aspects of like just talking about the monad, like everything around just mixed modal, and that's where it gets into generalized conversation, reductionist approach, simple designs, theses based upon what you think is successful for that monad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we wanted to break that out and put it into a dyad, it would be the athlete and the task. And now you still have mixed modal as the process, right? It's the monad, but the athlete and the task are the two things that have to be, worked with. And then you get into design of, what I talk about largely within the sport, is the competition. And I extract, hours and hours around what goes into the competition and what it's about, et cetera, et cetera. And then I also talk about the athlete, right? Female athletes, male athletes, young athletes, old athletes, assessments of athletes, pacing of athletes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be examples of the dyad and the dyadic tension between, of course, the athlete and the task. And then third, building off that, you would have, just because it's so simple, and I've just been discussing it more recently with skill development, you will have the environment, the task, and the observer. And those three areas would be what's considered a triad, and still having the context of mixed modal. So you can have an individual who is going to be participating against the task, but there's going to be a reconciling time clock to deal with, or a reconciling audience, or the music is super loud in Utah at 5,000 feet elevation. So there's three areas there that have to be considered in terms of what you're asking me to do, which is just to break out mixed modal into different concepts. And then for the tetrad, it would get into something that you recognize, which is what we use as the goal and the aim for people. A tetrad of mixed modal would be, well, what's the context of what the ultimate aim is for the person who's inside of it? And then you have to assess the person as the ground, and then we have to set up, the supporting resources, which is called the assessment, and then a program design. So where they currently sit right now, the assessment of the person, the program design leads to the aim, and that's the four areas, which is called the tetrad of mixed modal. Septad goes into more, psychological evaluation of some pieces further up, and it gets just a little bit more complex after that.
Well, yeah, of course. By definition, we're just getting more and more complex.
Yeah.
So,
hope that helped a little bit.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, I hope that helped
for
a
sure.
little bit. Okay.
Yeah. So based upon that, then, especially in the context of sport, how then do we think about, if we can break down mixed modal into athlete, task, further break that down to include environment or coach or goal, etc., then you essentially have, however many hundreds of thousands of these groups all sort of like pointing up into mixed modal as a whole, right? For each individual athlete who is then competing. Is that a way to look at that as well?
Yeah, for sure. I love the way that you're, purposely trying to organize it that way, but it certainly does help to make mixed modal the concept of it to be the ideal, because then it allows people, I would argue, to respect it, as the highest order version of why everyone's trying to do what they're doing.
Sure. And then based upon that, we have, concepts of let's call it emergence, meaning that at a certain point, the whole takes on an aspect that cannot be described by the sum of its parts. Right, meaning that there's a layer at which that the sport exists, or like in an economics context that like a market exists or something like that.
Yeah.
What do you look at as the process by which this type of organization happens that does enable something to become, let's say, like a monad, like mixed modal in this context?
Yeah, I think. Well, I'm not sure if I'm understanding your question correctly, but I look at just concepts of chaos, or anti-fragile concepts, and recognize that sometimes within the systems, and that one system being a whole, there's a lot of shit inside of it that you can't control. And sometimes there's this unconscious organizing that happens that you have no control over. And that's what I see a lot, inside of the sport, not just in the task environment, but in the athlete's head, as well as just the whole organization of the competitions themselves. And I just think of it that way, Todd, and it allows me to be, to not get crazy, honestly, and just to recognize that although there is a whole part to this sport, there still is a whole lot of chaos inside of it, and I can't control a whole lot of what happens.
Yeah, I think we've touched on the term chaos in a few different contexts. So I have some questions about that. Meaning that if we use chaos and sort of like the whatever more colloquial meaning of it, it can just mean like a lot of different stuff happening at once that doesn't make sense at first glance, right? Or if we use it in a more like scientific definition, we can mean something like extreme sensitivity to initial conditions, like something like the weather. The butterfly effect is kind of like the popularization of the scientific concept of chaos, meaning that, if this little thing is different, then the entire system will end up in a totally different state. So it makes it very difficult to predict what's actually happening.
Yes.
So if we think about mixed modal sport, I think that we have some elements of both. If we talk about chaos, right? So some elements of just a lot of different stuff happening and it not being totally clear, what and why and how, et cetera, all of that stuff is happening. And then we also have aspects of biology, which are fundamentally chaotic, meaning that, we're dealing with these organisms that are, self-organizing based upon inputs, and we don't really have a lot of control necessarily over the state that they end up in, right? That we can just sort of like put pieces into place. So how do you attempt to, I guess, like pattern match and create something cohesive out of such a chaotic environment, both in like the scientific sense and the more like colloquial sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first of all, it's to recognize on the coach and athlete's behalf that there is chaos, and that has to be a really long, drawn-out conversation in order to be built with the relationship. And then secondly, you have to assess how they adapt to changing environments. And that can be done through simple methods of training. But you kind of get this idea, Todd, as to where they and you as a coach sit with how they deal with these perturbations.
Sure. So just in terms of like with a specific athlete, you can observe how they react to the changing environment. Yeah.
So you can do that through I would call them indirect or observational means, and you can also do it through some styles of training practice, as you know, which can be a whole different lengthy conversation to itself. But repeatability can certainly give lots of insight into that, because you push the unconscious envelope of expression, which allows you to extract some truths in how people can, put up with stress as imposed when it's willfully imposed as hard as possible. There's other ways too that we've experimented with that we kind of see as being a key performance indicator of people that are really good and they're able to organize, really quickly. And so we have, tests that you've probably seen before or participated in that are constantly varied tasks. And so you put tasks in order. There's 5 or 6 of them, and you do them back to back for a certain time under a certain intention. You rest, and then you switch the tasks up. And then you see how they perform with that. And then you rest for 5 minutes, and then you switch the tasks up again. And so that just gives you an indication as to, I would say, levels of resilience to this chaotic atmosphere.
Sure. And then from a bigger picture perspective in terms of, organizing your thoughts for something like mixed modal. I mean, we're dealing with a highly chaotic environment. How do you pattern match and decide if a pattern is real or if it is just chaos, right? That it's very easy to get lost in anecdote, which I think anyone who, has spent time reading fitness stuff online or forums or anything like that sees it, where someone's like, oh, I started doing, hip thrusts and all of a sudden my glutes got huge or whatever. And, no knock on hip thrust necessarily, but it's like, okay, well, is that really what happened?
Yeah.
You know, what is your measurement? Is that an accurate measurement? Are you sure it wasn't just the fact that you tried some like crazy squatting cycle before to try to make your glutes huge, and then you suddenly deloaded and only did hip thrusts and you got like a massive super compensation? Like who fucking knows what's happening? And I think that for me, I tend to, you know, be almost too slow to call cause and effect when I see it. I'm always like, I don't know. No one knows. No one knows anything. But I think that you tend to be a little more willing to pattern match and say, well, this is this. So I'm curious how you make those distinctions. Yeah,
I think, and we'll just use you and I as an example of it. And I don't really know your history on it, but I've been in I thought like that, Todd, a lot. So don't get me wrong, you know, it may seem like there's answers based upon that pattern recognition, but even in that unknown area of cause and effect, there's still what I see, and that doesn't make it right or wrong, but what I see, there still is some principles that make sense. Now, it doesn't mean that there's specific causes or correlatives that have a path, right? That is a pattern recognition that I'm like, oh, ding, 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 that's exactly what I said. But there are these, you know, like we discussed weeks ago, right? There's probably movement consolidation that happened when they were 11 that we don't even know about, right? There was like shit that happened. They weren't in a shitty ergonomic position for 7 years like everyone else, you know. Like, so there's always these, you know, when you look at the deep enough history and you see enough of it, it's just easier for me to be able to pick those patterns out. That's all. So for that area. For the reality question and where you see that, I think just with experience, you got to be able to, you know, sit back and look at it from afar, and a lot more of it will make sense to you. I'm not sure if that's helpful.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
Well, and I think that is something that we did talk about. You know, like you mentioned, that being able to sit back a little bit, and for you, less, you know, in the trenches on the floor coaching, gave you some space to. You know, try to see those bigger picture patterns and decide that potentially something is more of a principle that can be discussed or shared, rather than just like, who knows, it's all chaos, no one knows anything, we're all going to die, who cares? Yeah. Well, it almost went that way numerous times, I won't lie. You know, it did get nihilistic in certain times, but I did have lots of experience on the floor in the trenches and tried to do, let's call it, you know, lots of learning at the same time. And, you know, I did do lots of learning. My brain was capable of doing it. I was still being active, et cetera. And then I went into a different phase of my career where I coached a lot online. I coached in person as well. And then I also did education. And now I'm quasi, you know, coaching coaches who coach people. I still do a small amount of in-person coaching with individuals. Is that a triad? I do a lot of thought process. Yeah, indirectly it is, I think. It is. I'm glad you're extracting that out because I never thought of it that way, but I'm probably going towards that, you know, level as I just age, you know, over time. Yeah, that makes sense. So if we talk about like building these models, I think that one of the key aspects as well, other than just experience and attempting to observe a chaotic system and pull it apart, is also having discussions with other people. I mean, sort of like the one we're having now, and also, you know, reading stuff that people put out there and trying to see if that aligns with your model and updating appropriately if it does, or potentially, you know, saying, oh, you know what, actually that doesn't make sense, and changing your own beliefs within, let's say, fitness or otherwise. Who do you think is someone who you disagree with, who you think their perspective is worthwhile and is potentially valuable? Disagree with, and then secondary, something that's worthwhile? Yeah, but it's still worthwhile, right? Because I mean, there's plenty of people that you can disagree with where you're like, well, you know, this person just doesn't actually understand the points that I'm making, or they their model is less robust than mine, so I don't think it's worth trying to update my thinking based upon it. But there are a lot of people, you know, that are putting things out that you may think are valuable, even though you have substantial disagreement. Yeah. Nothing comes to my mind right away, so I'll just say, which is an easy pick, is that I disagree with CrossFit's public view on
how to get people better at the sport of CrossFit. But I think there's lots of utility in movement, great movement, and constant variance.
Sure. So what would you categorize that view as? Just that constantly varied functional movement at high intensity is the best path toward improvement in mixed modal sport? Would that be the statement that you disagree with?
Yes, that'd be the disagreement. Yep.
Sure. But you still think that the overall concept is worth paying attention to and trying to understand and extract value from.
Yeah, especially variance. I mean, as you know, there's so much power inside of that when it's extracted out.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I think that per our discussion earlier, that with skill acquisition, that there's an appropriate level of variance that maximizes the acquisition of skills as well as like the robustness of those skills in different environments. So, finding what is that appropriate amount of variance is like a key aspect of any coaching process. Yeah,
but as you know, I'm glad you brought that up. There's a shit ton of time that you spend in skills that can't be under the constantly varied high intensity format.
Yeah, sure. Like what would be an example?
I don't know, like every skill inside the sport.
But based upon that, right? That there's a time to purposefully build in that variance and chaos, and then there's a time to not have as much variance.
Oh, for sure. And but there has to be this area of measurement of intensity over the conversation of variance. That's the key, because when you have lots of variance with low intensity, that could really draw up great movement programs, volume, accumulation of skills, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But because the definition of intensity lies on top of it, and they can't and won't extract that, it's very tough to layer skills inside of the notion of constantly varied high intensity functional movements.
Sure. So let me push on this skill piece a little bit. So, if we take some skill acquisition research, that the concept of like block practice versus random practice, meaning that, either having people do, if we take, let's say like a soccer drill or something, that people who just do a specific drill repeatedly over a certain amount of time get much better at doing that drill, but they don't necessarily get better at playing soccer. And that people who are doing stuff that seems more chaotic or random tend to have more robustness to their skill acquisition, even though they might not make progress as quickly on a specific piece, right? I'm not sure if I explained that clearly. But clearly we're dealing with something like that within mixed modal sport. So where do you think that line is in terms of like, okay, we can do whatever every minute on the minute ring muscle ups, and you're going to get better at ring muscle ups, but it's in this every minute on the minute context, and that may not carry over into, say, like we talked about earlier, running around the block and doing power cleans and then doing ring muscle ups.
Well, first of all, drills are done not for carryover. Drills are done for context. And that's what we need to change our thinking on, especially within the world of mixed modal. Secondarily, and I almost, now that I start to speak mixed modal publicly, I usually sound arrogant about this area. It makes it seem like, mixed modal seems so special. It's kind of outside in this, James believes it's in this own fucking world on like skill development. But the issue why, Todd, a lot of skill acquisition and skill pedagogy and even reconsolidation of skills doesn't work for mixed modal is because the examples you had given are all under the context of sports in which intensity and metabolic demand is not where the skill needs to be embedded long term. So when you have, and it just becomes so gray and fucking chaotic and inside of the conversation as to skill, external, internal cues, how you pattern it, emotions before or afterwards, et cetera, to your point on blocking it versus organizing in a different way. The thing with skills inside of mixed modal is you still have to ask the question, where do these skills eventually end up? And the skills eventually end up being placed in the highest fucking metabolic demand with the worst movements that go against those skills, right? And that has to be your ideal of where the skill is performed. And then you need to work backwards, obviously, of like scalar levels of intensity. You sound like you're on a fucking steamship from 1904. That's what I was thinking. Is like this guy's rowing across the Atlantic on this thing.
Yeah, it's
you're in the boiler room.
We're headed straight for an iceberg. No, it's.
Anyways, my point on skills.
We got some clanging and banging.
Those are some pretty great tempo barbell cycling class you got going on there. Boom. Yeah, boom. Touch and go deadlift. One every 3 seconds for 30 minutes.
Nailing it.
Oh, man.
Nailing it. No, this is drop each rep.
Yeah, but dude. I mean, we can get into writing a rhyme right here. Start jamming it out. I'll wrap on this end. Okay, so, but that was my two things I wanted to hit on that. The education that's currently around skill acquisition. It's really hard to wrap that on top of the sport for mixed modal, simply because those skills need to be put into a really damaging, violent metabolic environment. And so, having conversations on like, which is not, it doesn't lack utility, Todd, when I say this, but like, will 3 ring muscle ups on the minute make people better at CrossFit? It's like, well, you're not trying to make people better at CrossFit. What you're trying to do is to create context, right? And that's what drills, i.e. the mixed modal skills like progression that I talked about with you, is that they need to be put in that context, but they have to ideally move towards a really fucking challenging environment. And so you can't put the traditional academic model of skill progression on top of it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
That it's a combination not just of the skill, like you said, but of the actual fatigue, which makes it more complex.
Oh, dude, right? Because there's like 8 different fucking things that could come up. It's like you're going to be met with 8 different Marvel superheroes, right? And you can't fucking just pull out your sword to go after Thor, Like your sword's not going to work for him, right?
Yeah, it's that, and probably like your discussion on endurance models previously, that it's not like, okay, throw this out, but that that model is developed for a specific application.
Yes.
And then when you change certain key variables, it's like, yeah, there may be some principles that you can extract, but it's not going to be the exact same process.
Yeah, thank you, because that does still give cadence to the skill acquisition academic model. And we certainly can't extract principles, but it's going to look really different in 10 years.
Yeah, and I mean, you can, if you take any other whatever complex area, you're going to see similar situations happen. Like if you take, the business of running like a micro gym, that there's certain principles to extract from that, but the principles that someone may have to operate downtown in a major urban environment with massive flux of people in and out of the area on a given month are not the same as the principles that someone in a suburban area where people are living their entire lives are.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
It's not that there aren't relationships between the two, but just applying a strategy from one directly to the other may not give you the results that you expect.
Exactly.
Yeah, got it. So I think based upon all that, we sort of talked about this idea of trying to pattern match in chaos, and there's sort of this salient example of genius like Isaac Newton, who essentially invents physics, but then also is spending his time searching for like numerical codes in the Bible, like just obvious crackpot stuff. Mm-hmm. So how do you attempt to, distinguish those in your own attempts to pattern match in a chaotic environment? How do you decide whether, okay, like I'm working on physics, or I'm searching for numerology in scripture?
Yeah, I think if I know what you're asking there, I put it into buckets really, and the buckets for my brain are 2 aspects of work, and that would be mechanics and metabolics, and there's obviously a dyadic tension and dyadic relationship between those 2. And those, give me the base support that's needed, and then the human comes into practice, right? The human is the reconciler, which makes it a triad. With the monad context being, of course, pattern matching. And so at this triad level, I'm saying, how is the human deciding upon what they need to do to get the most out of their mechanics and most out of their metabolics. And that's where I start so that I don't, go crazy looking for numbers inside of scripture.
You've got
not that I have not
butcher's paper. Yeah, you got butcher's paper up on your wall and like all kinds of notes scribbled on it. And
well, my office is a kind of a John Nash atmosphere here, and I swear to God, I wrote down hashtag 39 because it came up yesterday like 3 times in weird scenarios, and it's really weird that you just brought up Newton and scriptures and numbers, but. I swear to God, that's going to mean something. I'm not sure. Maybe your question. Like if you had said 39, I probably would have got off the call.
Yeah. Well, right when you said 39, my recording I think said 57:39 in terms of the time.
Todd, you're just playing with me now.
I didn't actually see it, but it was probably close.
I'm sure
it probably was actually close because by the time I looked, it was like 57:43 or something. So at least close. No. Okay, so the answer is that you may be a total crackpot numerologist who's just
claiming that there's buckets. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Although there are some interesting, I guess, carryovers, or not necessarily carryovers, but those crackpots who write letters to physicists and claim to have discovered the unified theories and all those kinds of things. Yeah. That there are some really interesting similarities in terms of the way that they present information, which I don't know anything about it, but if you like look at their websites and all that kind of stuff, you can sort of see this same type of thought process where there's very clearly like a massive amount of intelligence to sort of know what's going on. Yeah. But then a very particular type of disorganization and sort of like random connections being made between stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you asking for a commentary on that as if I viewed it before, or you're asking... What are you asking?
I don't even know if there's a question.
Okay.
Just putting it out there.
Yeah, no. I think it's the theme of what you've been discussing, a pattern recognition. As you were saying about the letters coming into those people on those theories. I get that a lot. I mean, you participated in that with the beta version of mixed modal, where people get to offer up these, what I would consider their own ideas of how I've never thought of it in a certain way. And then that's my goal, is to extract these patterns inside of what everyone says around how they deliver the best program. So that's where my mind went on your pattern recognition point.
Yeah. And with that context of like actually having discussions amongst coaches, in science, for example, there's this concept of peer review where you create your paper and you submit it to a group who reviews it and tells you whether or not it makes sense. And there's kind of this, even though there's rivalries and all kinds of dyads and triads and and such within the overall context of people doing science, that the overall goal of that social structure can be to sort of like prove or disprove or create probabilities surrounding knowledge. Whereas in coaching, there's much more of these kind of like isolated people, quote unquote gurus, sort of like putting their information out there. And maybe not having this broader structure that's attempting to either validate or invalidate those ideas. Do you see a role for, I guess, like a more robust way for coaches to challenge their ideas?
Yeah, I think we're going that direction with the IF3, and I guess we call it more of a social democratic position on sport for mixed modal. And don't get caught up with your panties or pants with when I say social ideological perspectives on it for sport, but that's really what it is. It's a group of individuals who have this concept of where the sport should move, and it's not based upon commercial interest, right? So I think what happened with the growth of the sport leads to what you were discussing and having these silos of ideas. And that's just generally people trying to put food on the table, Todd, to be honest. I don't think it was out of ill intent. Of course, there's probably percentages of people who did it out of ill intent to be a part of it. That would be the, Fit Pro YouTube gurus, right? That just travel around talking to people and actually don't make any impact within the sport whatsoever. this report on horse shit that other people want to like and talk about so they can be a part of the conversation. So I think that it's moving towards this area of an opportunity, as you would say, to get these all these group leaders together, because there's lots of work to go around and we're all doing it for the right intent, which is basically to give athletes and coaches a full chance of maximal expression within the sport, and to do it safely and to do it, professionally, and to have some governance to it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So that's the future, Todd, what you're talking about. But currently, yes, I do think it's the case, but I don't think it was poorly intended. I think it was just because the sport was based upon commercial interest and just being young.
Yeah, that some sort of order is going to show up based upon either chaos or incentives or whatever.
Yeah.
And that the current order that showed up does have a little bit of that, I guess, siloing, to use the term that you used.
Yeah. And mixed modal, I was hoping that mixed modal could be that, starting point, right? Because, it's obviously there's a cost for the education, but you don't even have to do mixed modal for me to sleep good at night, knowing that I at least put it out there. So at least it's creating this language and context, and that'll start some of the ordering process so people can see that you don't have to be in it for the money making process or the popularity.
Yeah, and what do you think the incentives would need to be for people to want to, I guess, share more or be more involved in a bigger picture discussion of the sport and best practices and principles, so that it pulls people out of silos?
Yeah, I think it's as I said, I think it's starting the conversation on a vision of what the sport could be. I think that's what's happening, and that's what needs to start. And then I think when people can start grasping this new vision on what it could be for the sport, they'll also probably look around and go, yeah, every other sport is like that. That totally makes sense. That wants to move, right? Wants to move up the scale to be something that's respectable and a place for athletes and coaches, and to not bark against commercial interest, because as you know, that has to be a part of any sport. But there has to be a nice union of the two. So I think it's currently happening with what's going on right now, Todd.
Yeah, got it. And then if we sort of zoom out from I guess sport specifically, we've been talking a lot about thought organization and systems, et cetera. And you mentioned that Bernie really helped you clarify your thinking in terms of how you build these systems. Has this type of system building, is that always something that you've done? Have you done this in other areas of your life? How does that mental process function for you?
Yeah, it's certainly, as I said, to review, it certainly helped me organize things effectively for scheduling my time and just making sure I have balance, et cetera, et cetera. Because I was still, I would say, in my life and my relationships and my work and what I did, I probably still had this essence and personality and level of intelligence, et cetera, based on my experiences at 23 years of age, let's say, that still kept me, let's call it, on a straight and narrow for me to make my own decisions and to try to figure out balance and structure and et cetera. It was always something that kind of made sense to me. But then when you get someone, and that's we're calling Bernie today, and books, and you get experiences, you start recognizing that there's now a language to why you did what you did. And so I just have appreciated the opportunity to learn from other people and to read that language, so now I can make sense of what I currently always was doing, but now I'm making sense of it. And knowing that, to answer your question, allows me, yes, then to organize everything, excuse me, which has to do with how I spend my time, what do I spend my time on thoughts, and where do I put my energies, and those are important.
Yeah, so there's an element of, a behavior or a pattern existing, and then someone puts a name to it, which then enables you to almost move up a layer of abstraction, because it's oh, this is what I've been doing, and now I can name it and organize it, and then I can take it up a notch because now this system is set.
Yeah, because it creates an explanation,
Are there any other thinkers or books or resources or anything that you've used that you've either over time or recently that you've viewed as being similarly helpful for understanding that process of thought organization?
Of thought organization, not so much, but I have I've been watching how people influence through spoken conversation, how they get a message across. So, and that is from multiple mediums, so let's just say if I have a list of 18 podcasts, that I would regularly rip through and listen to, and that number could be lower or higher, but I'm just giving you an example. They're very broad in thought and reasoning and what they're trying to get out for education and language and media, etc. Right? But I'm now, probably just due to the age, I'm old enough where I'm not only looking for the actual person on the other side of the podcast to be the beacon of hope for that information. I'm looking at how they get information across. What are the principles involved in how they speak it? So as I'm listening, for example, I just listened to a podcast today from, I think his name is Dan Harris, or it's 10% Happier podcast. And it was on this lady who was writing a book about misogyny and sexual assault within the Marines, and the kind of stuff that she's gone through, et cetera. And so I'm listening to it from multiple levels, right? So I'm saying to myself, well, what happens if I was a Marine for 10 years at the time that she was in there? How would I be viewing that? And what happens if I was a Marine that's retired from 30 years ago? And how am I viewing this if I'm a female at 16 right now who wants to get into the Marines? And how am I viewing this based upon my ideas and concepts around equality and diversity and intersectionality and the concepts that are that people should be thinking about, even in conversation in their head. So I'm looking, and so I hope that's making sense. I don't have specific sources of humans. I'm now just looking at how things are spoken in word, or how information gets across from one person to the other, and it allows me to be curious in thought as to how that's done most effectively, so that it, of course, lets me organize things better.
Yeah, so it's essentially a combination of, not just taking in the information, but paying attention to the actual structure of it, right? I mean, obviously, as someone who has done, countless presentations and spoken to groups on different topics and done podcast interviews, that there's a meta level of, okay, how is this communicated? And then there's also to your point, almost like a postmodernist take on, okay, well, how would a different type of individual with a different background potentially be parsing that information based upon the delivery as well?
Yeah, I just find, and for me personally, I find it really, it strengthens my brain. It's like that. I'm going to mess this up, but Sudoku, or it's like a brain training for me. It's
Sudoku.
Sudoku,
like the number games.
Yeah, the number games.
Yeah,
I was just using it as an analogy of brain games, but it's kind of brain games for me. So it allows me to, and remember, my job at the end is fitness coaching, right? At the end of the day, when I go to bed at night, that's the armor and the superhero jacket that I put on in the morning, right? I'm that emblem of a fitness coach that I really value highly, not just myself, but the position itself. And within that, of course, I think that, as you know, coaches need to have that kind of curiosity, but also be a chameleon, right? Where we sit in this netherland of being careful of specific biased views, but being this open space to be able to have numerous different conversations, because essentially what we're trying to do is just align people appropriately, and we can't have a bias.
Yeah, that there's, I don't know if empathy is exactly the right word for it, because I think that word can have a lot of different contexts or meanings in different contexts, but that there is an ability to put yourself in someone else's brain that is crucial to coaching.
Oh, there is. And, I'm going to take a stretch here, but if there was some data done on DNA sequencing for all the quote unquote best, avatars of coaches in the world, I would say that they're probably like the, if for example, if Jesus Christ had the DNA of the highest level of DNA coding for compassion, then I think fitness coaches would score really high on the DNA coding for the genes for empathy. Yes.
Sure, and I think that to kind of clarify that point, if we can probably distinguish empathy in this context from the personality trait of agreeableness, meaning sort of how much you care about how other people are feeling or what they think of you, or being nice to people.
Yeah, because agreeing has a form of judgment on it, right? But empathy is just understanding.
Yeah, and then that I would as an armchair psychologist potentially rate you highly on capacity for empathy in terms of potentially understanding someone else's point of view, and very low on agreeableness in terms of like how much you care about what they think of you and how much you want to be nice to them.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And that combination is potentially
that's a good thought project. That's a great thought project.
Great for coaching.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great thought project. It just makes me think of a bunch of different systems of XY axis of agreeableness and empathy, and how you can get a scalar change in that for a coach. So thank you for that.
Yeah, there you go, a new system.
Yeah.
But that's not to say that someone may just have a slightly different style if they have, let's say, higher agreeableness than someone like you.
Yeah.
That the way they may approach that is different, but it doesn't mean that they might not still be effective in terms of being a coach to that individual.
Yeah, no, not at all. I think there's there's other cofactors, right, that go into that for the relationship.
So if we sort of circle back on the concept of, listening to a bunch of different podcasts or reading widely and, filtering that through the awareness of how the content is created and communicated, as well as the potential reactions of different individuals. How do you think about the stuff that you take in? Is this always like a coaching project where you're like, how can I relate this to coaching? Is it stuff that you take in for entertainment and play? Do you just sort of like take stuff in and hope that connections bubble up later? What is your thought process there?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, man. I'd be honest with you, because I'll just give you an example. Last night, walking with my dog and listening to a couple of them, I actually thought about this, so it's on the tip of my tongue. This is how I see it. So the information comes in and I give it time. And as it's coming in, I'm saying to myself, why, James, are you reacting to or listening to it? And how are you feeling based upon what the information is that you're getting? And so I really make it personal initially, Todd, to say a conversation on like the one today, right? I would look at that personally and say, now, how am I feeling about her position, Dan's position, and the global positions that I talked about from other people and how they saw it? I'm kind of saying to myself, what am I getting from that? What kind of things does it bring up in my history? With me as a person and how I view things and what my beliefs are, where does that sit? So that's generally what I initially do. And then secondarily, I'd say would be the previous point that I already talked about, where I'm saying to myself, which will essentially, of course, as you can imagine, help me as a coach. It allows me to look way out there, right, at 25 different people and say, I possibly could have 25 different conversations based upon this one topic. And to me, that doesn't look threatening. To me, that looks really exciting in regards to fitness coaching. So that's how I kind of process that information, if that's helpful.
Yeah, for sure. That's something that I think about in terms of consuming various information is, okay, should I be focusing only on things that are, going to immediately help me with a potential issue or problem that I have, or should I, take in a lot of stuff from a lot of different areas, which I enjoy doing, but may not have, as immediate of a payoff in terms of like solving a specific problem or building a specific skill set.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that was all I was going to say.
Oh yeah, no, man, I just thought about that with who was the gentleman? Frick, it was on a most recent Sam Harris podcast, and this guy is like deep into AI function, and I follow Eliezer Yudkowsky, if there's a name no one knows about, for AI and the hands it gets into, and the future, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a kind of just a personally really interesting topic for me. Anyways, to your point is that I listened, and halfway through the podcast, I was finding myself like working super hard to stay with this gentleman with the ideas that he has proposed, like super hard. When you're like, you almost need to close your eyes and put your hands over your face to like almost like really sink in what he's saying. But to your point is that, I could have stopped listening, but I didn't, so I kept saying to myself, just be patient, like allow yourself to get through this, and you'll be able to extract some of the pieces from it that will make sense to you, right? To your point on, some of them, You may not want to listen to them, but I'm under my belief, I think there's a lot of things you can extract even from the things that may not be apparently obvious to you, that you should still stick it out, because you'll get some really good shit from it.
Yeah, and I also listened to that interview. It's with Nick Bostrom.
Yeah, Bostrom. Yeah. Jeez,
yeah, he has
that was heavy.
A book called Super Intelligence, and I think a lot of the things that were challenging about it were also unique to like the audio environment, because it was a lot of like statistical. It's a lot of statistical thought experiments.
Yeah, that's
which,
true.
If you're just listening to someone, can be pretty hard to kind of like keep all the pieces in place and parse out what they're actually saying. And something like that probably functions much better either like written or like with a diagram, so you can look at and see, oh, okay, like these are the 3 scenarios that we're potentially talking about.
Yes.
And these are the weighted probabilities of each of them. And that just, that you sort of run into like a short-term memory problem. just trying to, it's like, you're trying to remember like 6 people's phone numbers at once. And you're like, wait, I'm sorry, what's happening?
Well, all I was thinking about, this is as effed up as it was. I had listened to a Peter Attia Drive podcast earlier, and he talked about circadian rhythm, which is right up my alley. So I was like, oh, cool, I'll just be listening to this because I'll just be able to refine my language, etc. And as I was listening to Bostrom, all I was thinking is like, I don't have enough adenosine. I can't make enough ATP to think hard enough. There's something wrong at the end of the day where my adenosine levels are so low. That's all I was thinking about. It was like, melatonin is creeping up and my cortisol levels are dropping and I can't do this.
Yeah, that's real.
It is real. I couldn't think.
Yeah.
It's power. It's powerful to think hard,
Yeah, I do
prioritize
stuff at different times of day based upon that like I don't know if you follow Chris Masterjohn as well, but his stuff is super dense, biochemistry, which I don't necessarily have like a formal background in, which is funny given that I have like a chemical engineering degree and we learned all the layers of chemistry and science and biology other than like actual biochemistry.
Yeah.
So, following that stuff is hard as hell. And it's like, okay, I'm not going to listen to that at night.
Yeah.
There's no chance.
Yeah. Yeah, the nighttime listening, there is a window of opportunity, I'll say, for sure.
And then I think that another question that comes to mind is the idea of trying to extract this meta skill of, thinking through these difficult pieces and trying to build a model of it, right? And how much is that potentially applicable across areas? Because, you can sort of, if we circle back to our conversations on skill acquisition, it's like, okay, well, how much does doing muscle ups in this context translate to doing muscle ups in that context, right? How much does learning French translate into learning Spanish? And it's like, well, maybe not that much, but in the bigger picture, can you develop the capacity to learn languages, which then may make all future languages that you learn easier to learn?
Yeah.
And probably, I don't know.
Yeah, that's the beautiful tie-in of what I said, the wonder and mystery and fascination around variation, especially in the physical environment for production of power for mixed modal. I find it like superbly fascinating. I just think that it went the wrong way like 15 years ago. And it was slapped, inside of a commercial entity where big aspects of it and just being really good at movement in a bunch of different ways was pretty damn cool. And for, as I mentioned, I'm just repeating it, but for skill consolidation, where we butt our head up against there when variance gets so high is that it essentially has to get into some really challenging environments. And that's where it's not a cookie cutter anymore.
Yeah. Well, and to sort of zoom in on that, I think another layer to that as well is what people in the market want to do.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not just like necessarily like a purely top down, like nefarious commercial piece, but the fact that people like doing things in a certain way and they don't like doing them in another way. And if you end up catering to what people want from you, you may end up giving them what isn't necessarily best for them.
Yeah. Yeah. That's that's a tough one to break, Todd, because I totally am empathetic to the user. They've been told probably at a young age and now in the current time that it could probably happen a whole lot faster than what I'm proposing. And so I get that. I totally understand it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that even in the picture of if we sort of stick with like mixed modal sport or whatever, especially for a population that isn't maybe like seriously competitive in terms of trying to qualify for anything or win any actual like prizes or other than like a bag of protein on a weekend or something, right? But to them, that they're playing a recreational sport. It's the same way that someone goes and plays beer league softball or flag football or something like that, and they're like, "Yo, I'm here to fucking scrimmage. Yeah. Like you're trying to get me to do like step ups and like side planks, and I'm here to play. Like, what are we doing?"
Yeah, you got it. And well, that's a whole other. I'm not sure if you're asking a question or you're just talking about the context of the sociology. And I guess the cultural idea around it, but you know how I feel on that. I don't want to go on a soapbox of it, but that's where the context of fitness versus sport has to be divergent. And I think the representation of what you're calling scrimmage for fitness just has to look different. And I think it's really now scaled CrossFit Games at the local competition for the protein bag, and it shouldn't be. You know what I mean? It should be like. Run over, do a rope climb with a big blue soft mat underneath it, perform 20 really fucking good push-ups afterwards, and then run a 400 meter to the finish. Okay. And then you're going to do 3 really good deadlifts a half hour later. And if your form doesn't look good, you will not get scored for that score. All right. And then the last event is going to be, you see that flywheel bike over there? You're going to do 20 calories as fast as possible, and these things that we call burpees right behind it for the next 3 minutes, and then you're going to be given an award after that. So the way that I just phrased that, you can see the context of it. It'll still allow people to get in there and like participate, right? Like you're calling it just a weekend soccer tournament, where we would presume, of course, that the 100 entries are going to be able to climb a rope or do a push-up, etc. But I think we just need to create some governance around what that looks like so that they can actually participate on the weekend, right? And then they'll probably see, wow, you know what? In order to do that push-up better, I probably need to do side planks during the week. And now we're tying it together. But because they see, 85 toes to bar after 25 bar muscle-ups, they're thinking, there's no way in hell I'm going to be doing side planks in order to get those bar muscle-ups, right? That looks nothing like that. So I think that's where it's lost, is we're taking people who are playing like street hockey and then saying, oh yeah, slap on the skates and we're getting on the ice in Maple Leaf Gardens on the weekend.
Yeah. That is, I think that's a pretty apt analogy.
Yeah.
It's like I think actually Sam Harris, who we've mentioned, uses this analogy for meditation, meaning that he's like, no one teaches us how to use our own mind, and we just sort of walk up to the equivalent of the 100-meter finals at the Olympics in terms of the powers that our brain has, and no one's taught us what to do, and we're just like, all right, go. Good luck.
Put this app on.
Yeah. Get out there. Good luck. Yeah. And I think it's that if we take the analogy of hockey, that that skating around and shooting on a goal on a street is not the same thing as being on ice in primetime NHL.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, you're getting thrown in with a bunch of Peter Forsbergs, that are the all-around players. And so now you have this model, right? You're like, and you can imagine what it's like. I mean, even as kids, we're like that. We're playing against these better people, and we're like, I want to be like that. What is he doing? It must be the thrusters in the protein bag. I mean, that's exactly what I need to do. It's like, no, it's not the thrusters, man. He's been doing it for 10 years.
Yeah. So he's been doing it for 10 years, and he adapts way faster than you ever will.
Yeah.
So he has more time, and his speed of adaptation is multiples of yours.
Yeah. And other things, right? That's where I talk about for KPIs, tissue tolerance. There's probably shit underneath the hood that we don't even know about in terms of lactate usage, lactic tolerance at the muscle level that I think could be investigated, because there could be some people out there who are, 18 years of age, who've done a couple of weights, and then they join in CrossFit, and within 6 months, they're just like magicians, and so I think there is some unwritten, avatars or unspoken avatars that are out there that are just yet to be investigated. To your point that some people can, be out there and beat Peter Forsberg in 6 months, but that's a unicorn.
Yeah. Well, let me push you on that a little bit, because I'm curious what your theories are there. Because I mean, clearly the way that different people respond to metabolic fatigue is, I mean, it's not the same.
Yeah, definitely.
And that you do have some theories surrounding what may be going on as far as the folks who seem to just not get tired the way that other people do.
Yeah.
And we can discuss like lactate and potential different like metabolic models. Like what do you think is happening for those people?
Yeah, I think for the, I'll just put it into two buckets for the conversation and for our audience. I think for the really good people, we probably don't have it investigated enough yet. But the good people have allowed me to formulate a model on what I consider to be different things that make people tired. And I think within the context of mixed modal, it has to be built out to be more than just the central governor or more than just a mechanical peripheral model. My belief is that there's probably, 6, 7, 8, or 9, different kinds of reasons as to why people get tired. And I think what we see in the good people, to make it an easier answer, is that the good people just don't have those fatigue limiters that come up for whatever reason. And I think yet that has yet been to be investigated as to why they react that way. But I posit a couple of ideas that I just previously talked about. And I think at a metabolic level, if I was to say at a metabolic level, I really do think that underneath the hood, they have this unbelievable capability of lactate usage that I think that even of may be interest to you, Todd, for I'm not sure why it would be, but I'm just sensing it would be, of the metformin research that's been done for insulin resistant individuals or diabetic individuals. And if you look at those situations, and they have studied that disease at a really deep level and looked at metformin and its capabilities of helping people out for that. And that essentially is what I believe at the deepest level for the best people in the sport, they do have, is this unbelievable ability to use some of those fuels, lactate, better than others. And then secondarily to that, I think they have this, it could be because of that first factor, but I think they have this unbelievable tissue tolerance that, of course, leads to, as you can imagine, very low perception of pain and a great ability to be able to put up with a whole bunch of damage, even unconsciously, that they don't even perceive to be a problem in getting tired. And then for those people who are not that good, on the other side, Todd, I think they have a whole ton of different kinds of limitations that need to be extracted so that you can pick on them effectively in order to improve their performance long term.
Yeah. So if we dig in on that concept of lactate reutilization, so you're thinking that there may be something going on where people essentially, are spitting off a bunch of lactate and metabolic waste from, just the normal cellular metabolism processes related to high intensity exercise.
Yeah.
And that some people are then effectively able to reutilize that waste as fuel rather than having it be like a fatigue inducing situation.
Yeah. And because you mentioned that at the end, I'm not stating that lactate is the fatigue-inducing situation, because we do know that it's hydrogen ions and tissue tolerance and perception of pain and a whole bunch of other things that lead to that. And it's got a lot to do with as well buffering as well as threshold and practice of lactate. Because some people, especially in scientific endeavors, have studied that, but they forgot to mention that these people didn't train any type of lactate training up until the contest or the test. But in my observation, when people train lactate training for weeks and weeks on end, then they do some forms of testing, they result in buffering and using it, and also, let's just say, to repeat that word, consolidating it more effectively than other folks because they've trained it. So I think that at that deepest level, yes, to your point, there's something going on underneath that I think we may need to look into disease research in order to figure out what that is. And the metformin research.
Meaning in terms of like.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I
was going to just say that maybe something with the various scenarios that can happen with lactate in terms of like where it gets shuttled, and various like recessive genetic disorders where people are just missing certain enzymes, and then you end up with like the crazy buildup of lactate in these scenarios that can be toxic and cause all kinds of problems, and that they're that researching that may point to some areas where it's like, well, imagine instead of rather than being, not having this enzyme? What if someone had way more than normal? Like what actually happens in that context?
Yeah, because I've seen it over time, and it's not just been two groups. So I don't want to sound like I'm, coming up with this right now, but I've definitely seen it in different areas where some people get into what I'm calling lactic resistant scenarios. And it's very similar to the disease profile of insulin resistance on a much different scale, obviously, for different intentions and reasons. But these people go through, let's call it the lactate training sessions or lactate pathways, and they do it too long. But it's not only their level of resilience that doesn't allow them to continue to go, because these people, outside of just having lactic resistance or lactic endurance in their training, are fairly resilient people. But something happens over time. Now there's other groups, and these are generally the people that you see doing crazy voluminous workouts that are intense, and fairly hard. But these people continue to, quote unquote, still survive and get better without too much undue injury or micro trauma and RNA transcription, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's within those people, there's something happening as a dose response that they are reacting completely differently on a cellular level to the same lactic production, right? So that means that there is like two streets. And I just think it over time we'll find that it's not only just in training that's going to get people to that point. I think it's epigenetic and it's inside of them.
Yeah, and I think that concept of lactate resistance is very interesting, in that when people overtrain in mixed modal sport, that you can see something like that happen, where essentially they just hit this point of like shutdown.
Yeah, they can't do it anymore. They can't train anymore. Even when they try to go hard, they can't. And then you start getting into
it's just gone.
Yeah, it's just not there.
And they don't even necessarily feel like, oh, I'm like broken down or injured or whatever. It's just flat out, okay, cool. Like everything seems fine. Go hard. You can't.
Yeah.
Why?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. That there's some sort of switch that got flipped.
Yeah.
Well, if anyone is doing actual, detailed metabolic research on this stuff in the future, I think there's so much under the hood that could be discovered in terms of what actually happens with all these different fuels and the utilization of them, specifically in this mixed modal environment that, isn't the same as just, oh, what's your respiratory quotient? How much, carbohydrate are you allegedly burning, et cetera. It's way more messy than that.
Yeah. I mean, and it's not like I'm not trying to do that. I mean, I have maybe 50K worth of equipment here that I do some testing for different individuals on, right? Just to extract some kind of ideas as to what it means for physiological testing, but it's not giving me tremendous answers on what that means, because as you know, it's very challenging and costly, and to create, groups and cohorts and correct research and design to get anything from that.
Yeah. And I mean, I have no idea what, or perspective on what it would look like to potentially try to extract all the different, pieces as far as the ways that lactate could or couldn't be shuttled to various endpoints or intermediates along the way, if it is being metabolized more effectively by some people through certain pathways, right? That they're, can you pull out like, okay, well, how much pyruvate do you have, and how much lactate do you have, and how much oxaloacetate do you have, and whatever, and try to make some sort of judgment based upon that. Yeah,
well, I have a thought process on that, if you got a second. I think that there's enough current data to extract these different lanes. So what you get is that you get a survey conductor or a conductor for the research design, and he or she has no idea where all these people have finished. In regards to the sport of the same task, and let's just call it the open, right? In CrossFit, it's a very simple data board. It's like you either finish second or you finish 12,000, right? But you could actually look like, so there's a lot of people that look like Matt Fraser, right? But they're not as good as Matt Fraser, is my point. So, you can have them come in, and I think that's where the starting point is. You take a full inventory of people in a non-working situation, which would just be a information pull of a shit ton of data, right? Everything underneath the hood. Sex hormone stuff, electrolytes, blood work, the full gamut, right? DNA, HRV, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if you put all of them up on the board, I think you will be able to start preliminarily looking at some of the extractions. I don't think it's going to get as deep as what you said. I agree. To get into the working environment and to see exactly how everyone's using what they are. But if you just start with the pieces, right? The pieces of everyone, I think you'll get what I have seen thus far with some small, interesting points. You'll probably get some observations that you just can't turn your back on.
Yeah. Yeah. That I think that the ability to collect like larger pieces of data as well. I mean, we were talking about AI a second ago, right? That if there is that opportunity to try to get big picture data from a large population, that could at least generate some theories as far as, okay, what direction should be pursued, and what might actually be going on with people with different levels of, let's call it success in this sport, for example.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely a future thing that I want to be a part of. I hope I'm around long enough to see it come to fruition so that there's lots of measurement and human measurement happening when people go through these mixed modal environments.
James, that's it's an hour and a half and you got to go get a massage, man.
Yeah, buddy. Standing massage with Brandy.
Yeah.
There's a product placement, although doesn't have any opening hours for those who are in Arizona.
This podcast is sponsored by Brandy. Use code, what's the code?
OPEXfit.com/Brandy.
Yep. Code Brandy15 at checkout.
No rules.
No rules holders. First 10 buyers get a no rules folder.
No rules folder, yep. I'll deliver it personally.
That would be a delight. Great. So James, we talked a lot about your course. It's called Mixed Modal. What is the deal with it? If someone wants to learn, what do they do?
Yeah, well, it's for a unique audience that's really interested in the aforementioned pieces of the culture itself.
Yeah, I think if anyone made it an hour and a half into this, that they're probably interested.
Yeah. So if you are, thank you for that. No, Todd and I do thank you for that. Go to opexfit.com and it'll give you all the directives.
Great, easy as that. James, thanks for taking the time to chat.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always good to talk to you, man.
Thanks for listening all the way through. I admire your grit, your persistence, and your perseverance. Since you made it, I have a few favors to ask of you. Go ahead and open up the show notes on whatever podcast player you use. In there, you'll find links to all the resources that were mentioned throughout the show. There's also some links there in which you can leave a review or subscribe to the show. And podcasters are always harping on this because this actually makes a difference in terms of the algorithms that recommend podcasts to new people. So if you do that, it helps more people find the show. And if you head over to toddneef.com, you can sign up to receive most of my thoughts and writing, which really only go out to the email list. A lot of it never makes it to the blog or the podcast. So if you like what I have to say and you want to see some of my recommendations and stuff that I've been checking out, go ahead and subscribe to that email newsletter as well.